If you're watching this on the day that it comes out, then we are 1 week away from the UFC Fight Pass Invitational 8, and who cares? Guys, this is Sean with PDMA, and I care. I care that the UFC Fight Pass Invitational 8 is happening next week, and the reason I care is because there's a bunch of really good matchups on the card that I don't hear a lot of people talking about. And one of the reasons I actually think we're not hearing a lot of people talk about this is because if you look at some of the names on the card, they're names that I look at, and probably you, if you're watching this channel, look at and say oh my God, that's actually a really good matchup. But I think we're actually at a point now with submission grappling as a sport where we have casual fans, and some of the casual fans who haven't been following for that long might actually not know just how good a matchup some of these matchups are. And today we're going to go over the UFC Fight Pass Invitational as a whole. Where does it fit in with this modern sport, no-gi, submission grappling, with CJI and ADCC seemingly leading the way, and of course IBJJF playing their role? Where does the UFC Fight Pass Invitational fit into all of this? And before we go on, I just want to say that if you guys have any questions by the end of this video, that's something I didn't cover about the UFC Fight Pass Invitational, feel free to drop those comments below. I actually have some ways of maybe figuring out the answers to some of these questions, some people I can talk to. So if you guys ask questions in the comments, I'll try to get those questions to the people that can answer them. And if enough of you ask the same question, I can always make a follow-up video and talk to some of those people. But that out of the way, let's get into it. So the first Fight Pass Invitational happened on December 16th, 2021. And I know some of you are probably saying, wow, it's been going on for almost 3 years. And then some of you might be saying, wow, it's only been 3 years since this has been going on. And I think there's a reason for that. As we know, anything that the UFC puts their stamp on is going to be public facing in some sort. More people are going to see that versus if you or me just started a grappling organization. And I think that's an important detail here. The reason for that is because basically no two UFC Fight Pass Invitationals have been the same. The rules are constantly changing, the way they do things is changing a little bit, and some people might look at that as a negative, but honestly, I view that as pretty normal. Keep in mind that if you're starting a grappling organization from zero, you have to figure out what the rules are going to be, and the only way you can figure out if those rules are actually going to work for what you're trying to do is to put on an event. And for the Fight Pass Invitational, when you put on an event and you have the UFC's stamp on it, well, that event is going to be seen by people. So keep that in mind. If I start a grappling organization tomorrow, no one's going to see the first couple. If I'm lucky, maybe it'll grow into something bigger, but nobody's going to see those early days. And if we look back at the early UFC, the early MMA UFC, we actually see this type of thing reflected there. If you look back at that time, the rules were constantly changing, and things that we take for granted today, like weight classes and particular strikes that are legal, illegal, that kind of thing, that stuff that had to be experimented with, and that's what they were doing back in those days. I think that's actually what we're seeing with the UFC Fight Pass Invitational. You might be watching it and saying oh my God, can they just settle on one rule set? And yeah, I completely understand that argument, but understand that this is something that is currently in development. And this leads to, why is the UFC getting involved in grappling in the first place? And the obvious answer is they want to make money. And that's cool. I'm all about companies making money, especially companies like the UFC, who are a proven successful organization. Now, I didn't talk to anybody at the UFC behind the scenes or anything like that, but at the core of it, any business decision is made around that, and that's cool. But I don't think it's just that. I think the UFC sees what's going on in submission grappling right now, just like we all do, right? It's on this upward trajectory. Now $1 million prizes are there's money in it, and there's ways for these companies to get involved with submission grappling. And of course, we all know that UFC is not the first MMA organization to get involved in submission grappling, because we do have one championship who has submission grappling integrated into their cards. If you're not familiar, one championship will put on a card and they'll have MMA, they'll have kickboxing, they'll have submission grappling, they'll have Muay Thai, and they have it all on one card. But that's not what we see the UFC doing, and I actually think that's a very smart move by the UFC. And so, not to go too into the weeds in the business here, but I am a marketing guy, I do have a marketing background, and the UFC has gotten to where they are through MMA. So I don't think it would be necessarily a smart idea for them to start throwing submission grappling onto the cards. And especially if you watch the UFC, you know that the average UFC fan absolutely hates when anything interesting in grappling is happening. And if you're like me and you have a grappling background, you're like, oh my goodness, this is the most exciting part of the card. And then your friend who's been sitting there who, knows who Conor McGregor is just like, oh my God, stand those guys up. So I don't think it would be a smart marketing or business move for the UFC to take what a lot of their fans consider to be the most boring part of the sport and then put it on the card and say, hey, you know how you like all those knockouts and head kicks and everything like that? Well, we're completely doing away with that, and we're going to put on a match where the guys just do the part that you always boo at. And for that reason, I think these Fight Pass Invitationals are actually a very, very smart idea by the UFC. They can take their main flagship MMA, they can still keep it over here, but then they can invest a little bit into submission grappling, which looks like an investment that's going to pay off. They have the resources, so why not throw on a couple cards? And if this submission grappling thing really takes off, well, now you're already established in the game. You can make all your money there, and maybe someday in some world it gets so popular that you do merge the cards and have that work. But I think especially for the American audience, which is a big portion of the UFC's audience, handling it this way is a very smart idea. So now let's go over to the Fight Pass Invitational 8 like I started this video with, and let's talk about why I think this is going to be a very exciting card, but why it might be flying under some people's radar. So a little while ago, I made a video and I called it like, what's next for Nicky Rod? And it was after CJI, and I listed out some opponents that I think could potentially make sense for Nicky Rod in his next match. And I'm gonna be completely honest with you guys, Michael Pixley was not on that video at all. Now that's nothing against Michael Pixley. I'm actually a really big Michael Pixley fan. I'm so happy for him for getting this match. I think that dude is on the rise and he is a phenomenal grappler. But I'm just being honest, I didn't see that next for Nicky Rod. And when they announced the match, in my head I said, oh, well, okay, I could see a potential stream of logic here. And actually that was confirmed to me by the UFC Fight Pass Invitational as to why they booked this match. And if you're not familiar, their reasoning, and you don't have to agree with this, but this is their line of logic, was that they thought the matchup to make was Nicky Rod versus Nicholas Marigali. Now, of course, we know that in ADCC this year, Michael Pixley beat Nicholas Marigali, and Nicholas Marigali got injured. So to the UFC, the next best logical thing was to take the guy who beat Nicholas Marigali. Again, you don't have to agree with that logic, but I'm just telling you what they have said as to why they booked this match. So whether we agree with that logic or not, that's our main event. And I think that makes sense because a lot of people are going to recognize the name Nicky Rod, and a lot of people are going to recognize the name Michael Pixley. All those PSF guys, they have a bit of a name, him, Jacob Couch, those guys, and people know who they are. But now if we move down to the co-main event, we have PJ Barch versus Renato Canuto. And if you're talking to me, it's like, take all my money. I would love to see this match, but I just don't think those names are as recognizable to a lot of the casual grappling fans. And now keep in mind, first of all, when I say casual, I mean that very respectfully. I'm talking about people who aren't like as directly into this as I am and as a lot of you watching this video are. So we have to keep in mind that the people who are kind of newer into here, or maybe just kind of, on the outskirts of what's going on in the grappling world, they might not actually know these guys. And one of the reasons I know that is because I actually made a short one time where I talked about how I thought PJ Barch actually had potential to win ADCC this year. I was wrong, but, can't predict the future. But I thought I made a legitimate argument, and people were like, you're going to choose a guy no one heard of? And I'm like, You've never heard of PJ Barch. First of all, he's in ADCC, so it's not like he came out of nowhere. He's made it to ADCC Worlds, and he's a phenomenal grappler. So again, I think those of us that are kind of in this forget that people on the outside might not know who he is. And the same thing, we can go down this list, but we look at a match like Gabriel Sousa versus Josh Cisneros. Again, take my money. These guys have actually gone against each other in the gi twice. But again, a lot of people might not know that, and they might be like, okay, who are these two guys? So I think that is the reason this card might not be getting as much media coverage as some of us would expect it to, because keep in mind, those of us that are in, we know who these guys are. We know how exciting these matches are going to be. But for a lot of people that are newer to grappling and that only know like the really, really big names, there aren't a ton of them on this card. And to be honest with you guys, two of the matches that I think have like the most potential to be two of the more exciting matches on the card are two matches I haven't really even heard almost anybody talk about, and that's Ronaldo Jr. versus Isaac. I'm not gonna even attempt to say his last name, probably butchered his first name, but y'all know who I'm talking about. And then Kashimura versus Cindy Ung. That match, if you guys don't know, actually they went against each other at Nogi Worlds, IBJJF Nogi Worlds at Purple Belt, and I just happened to be there for it, and it was like this barn burner of a match. It was so exciting to watch. Full disclosure, Cindy Ung is like one of my closest friends, but that doesn't change the fact that that match is going to be absolutely insane. Both those girls bring it every single time, and not a ton of people are talking about it. So that's where we're going to wrap it up. I hope this made you guys a little more excited for this upcoming Fight Pass Invitational card, and I hope it gave you a little insight into the Fight Pass Invitational as a whole. Again, if you guys have any questions about the Fight Pass Invitational, anything we talked about, whether this one coming up or the history, let me know. I'm going to try to put some feelers out there. I know some of the people that I can ask these questions to, so drop your question in the comments and I'm going to respond to it. If you guys like this style of content and want to see more videos like this, as well as match breakdowns, BJJ history, and current events, go ahead and please click that subscribe button. That really tells me that I'm making the kind of videos you want to see. With all that out of the way, I just want to say thank you very much for watching, and I will see you next time.